Greetings. My name is Gino, and I would like just to do this video to assist students who are sitting for their CTA, CAA, CTA examinations in terms of how you can further improve your answering technique, your exam approach, approach on exam day, and even your study approach towards the exams. The learning outcomes are, first, can we understand, or how do you get to understand the required? Secondly, how can you understand the scenario better? Is it important? And how can you do it? Thirdly, you need to be able to plan your solutions and come up with some form of expectation of where the value is going to be in terms of your solution. And in the process, we'll touch on text principles, we'll touch on how to apply those text principles and how to conclude. Right, we also want to learn things to do with your communication skills and how it affects your examination. And lastly, we'll dig into problem solving. So let's reflect on the role of understanding the required in you coming up with a good solution. So in understanding the required has a lot of components. Number one, the required will tell you who the taxpayer is. The required will give you an instruction: discuss with calculations, calculate with brief narrations, analyze, review this paper. So the required gives you guidance, and disaggregating the required is the first step towards building your own solution plan. You need to break down the required into some of these components. The required tells you the year of assessment. So for example, if you're dealing with a share option scheme with a vesting period of more than 4 years, you have to be careful when asked to discuss tax implications. As an example, which year of assessment, because probably the granting or contracting happens in the 1 year and the vesting or exercise may happen in another year. And therefore, the year of assessment scopes in or out certain elements of that scheme. Mark allocation has a signaling effect. It tells you how much you should go and how much you should not go. It tells you the tax rate. Discuss tax implications means for CTA examinations, me and IC, it means discuss VAT, income tax, and CGT. So further understanding the required, just as an example there, here's a typical required. Discuss the tax treatment of the lease transaction in section B in the hands of both the lessee and lessor for the 2023 year of assessment. So here we've got discuss. So we're very clear that I will be looking at principles, application, and conclusion. And where possible, I'll be looking at case law. So for every discussion point that I pick up, I can be easily grossing 4 or netting on 3 marks. So it's now just a matter of identifying the transaction and knowing how many principles I'm going to be discussing. Here it says tax treatment, which means I'm doing CGT, I'm doing VAT, and I'm doing income tax. In some cases, you find that there's not much under a particular tax rate. So for instance, whatever the lease transaction was, if it then didn't culminate in the disposal of a specified asset, it means for CGT purposes, that lease transaction would simply be a 1 marker that says there's been no disposal of a specified asset, therefore no CGT arises. So it depends on what's in the scenario about that lease. And then the tax treatment, so we've done that, we've agreed on what tax treatment means. Lease transaction, so now we need to read the scenario and know what the lease transaction is all about. But you see, it's very important because there could be a lease payment, a lease premium, and improvements on that lease. And even with the lease payment, it could be split between a lease principal amount and a lease interest. So all those things inform the structure or my solution plan, because I'm already seeing a discussion, and I know I take 3 to 4 marks per tax principle. I've been asked to do tax treatment, so I know I'm doing 3 taxes. So easily 3 by 4, I'm already expecting 12, and now I'm told it's about a lease transaction. So I'm not sure how many within the lease, how many key transactions are there. So it can easily be 3 or 4 if there's lease payment, lease improvement, lease premium, multiply again by principal application and conclusion, multiply again by the 3 taxes. So 25 marks becomes a walk in the park. And to even better it, it then says in the hands of the lessee and lessor. So I do lessee, CGT, income tax, VAT, principal application, conclusion for most of the transactions, 3 or 4 transactions in the hands of the lessee, restart the process in the hands of the lessor. So I can easily hit 50 marks on this. 2023 year of assessment, again, it will depend on what's in the scenario to say which transactions fell within the year of assessment. Right. And to further that, sometimes cherry on the top, we get a communication mark, and in this case, it was about the presentation and the layout. So it should be very structured, very clean, clear, preferably even putting headers that I'm now dealing with VAT, I'm now dealing with income tax, I'm now dealing with CGT. At some point, maybe you're saying in the hands of the lessee, and even in the hands of the lessee to say this is about lease payment, and the breakdown should flow. So another example would be discuss this with supporting calculations. It's a variation to discuss the tax treatment. So it could easily have been discussed with supporting calculation, the tax treatment of the lessee of the lease. So we would need as well to look at what's in the scenario and see if we can do certain calculations where calculations are necessary. Calculate with brief narrations the tax treatment of the lease transaction. So here we're tabulating it, we're primarily doing a calculation, and then we're just putting in brief narrations. Calculate the income tax. In this case, it's a calculation, but not for all 3 taxes, but specifically for income tax. Discuss the income tax treatment. Again, now what has been scoped out is VAT and CGT. Right, so to further show the importance of understanding the required, you now come up with some table of expectation to say how many components are there, is there lease premium, lease payment, lease improvement, any interest, and so on. What tax principles do I want for each of these components? If it's a lease premium that I am receiving, it becomes a gross income item, and under gross income, we then look at what is the most relevant element of the gross income. Is it about the amount? How are we being paid that premium, or how are we receiving that premium? In which case there could be an amount issue. If it's plain and straightforward, then the question is, could there be an accrual? Especially if we receive these leases in arrears, or if we receive it in advance, we'll then have to look at which year of assessment are we including, and so on and so on and so on. So those are the tax principles. So we then apply those principles and then conclude with them. So let us move on to the next critical component that impacts on the solution plan, understanding the scenario. So here you get even more details. Just by reading the required there, we saw how we can begin to structure to say where my marks going to be. They are going to be about 2 taxpayers, it's going to be about 3 taxes, it's going to be about 4 or 5 transactions, in which I will have to discuss it for each transaction under all 3 tax heads, under both the employer and the employee. But now we want to say, how does the scenario impact on solution? So firstly, you will have to understand the industry, very important. it will give you an expectation of what to write and what not to write. You need to have a full understanding of the transaction details. So for example, now when you want to know the details of the lease, it could have been the old sale and lease back, it could be the old finance lease, it could be the old operating lease. But in all cases, there will be details that about how the lease will go. Within that scenario, we're looking at any instructions in the scenario which further buttress the required. So for example, in the scenario, it could have been a discussion that then said, you are a clerk and you're working for XYZ and you've been asked to do task A, B, C, D. Please do it in the form of an email and write a few slides. So what we would then want to see in your solution is the email and the slide format, because it's, although it wasn't explicitly stated in the required, it could have been stated in the scenario. So understanding the scenario in combination or read with the required gives us a fuller picture. And then you need to be able to approach all this as a problem solver rather than as a scholar who's just looking for the correct answer and get marks to pass. So an example is where you are given details about a share option scheme, that's employment income. So you need to ask, how does this scheme work? Never mind your tax. So you get to know, they would like to motivate people to stay on their jobs and to produce more. And for them to do that, they've identified a certain grouping of staff, maybe those with 3 years and above, as the staff that is eligible. And on grant date, they tell you that you will be allowed to buy shares at a certain price in the future. So you have an option to exercise that. And from day one, they begin to work towards this fruition of this share option. And come vesting date, the shareholder or the employee can then exercise. If they don't, what happens? There's some forfeiture of some sort. But even if they do, they can be allowed to then later on dispose of. And so what happens? So here what we're saying is, when you're reading the scenario, try and understand why something is being done. How does it benefit the employer and how does it benefit the employee? Because it is going to affect the arm's length principle as well. Time and timeline and phases, what happens at grant date, at vesting, at exercise, and at disposal. And you might also, from time to time, because of the integrated nature, you must also then be able to pick up the accounting issues from there. So combined with the required that says, discuss with supporting calculations the tax treatment of the share scheme in the hands of both the employee and the employer over the life of the scheme. That's how the required would look like. So having broken down the scenario, and even if we look at this required, we would need to break it down again, discuss with supporting calculation, tax treatment, which means I have all 3 tax heads, share scheme in the hands of both employer and employee, which means I have 2 taxpayers, over the life of scheme, which means we're not looking at a year in particular. So we're starting from grant and discussing it until we dispose of it. Solution plan for share option, therefore, it identified all 4 phases, identified the tax principles within each of the 4 phases. It identified the principle and where relevant it quotes case law, and each element was concluded on. So coming to problem solving, so this has been an approach that was saying, just please break down your required and also break down your scenario. You're halfway through solving the problem. We're saying, here is a model for solving problems. First, you need to be able to define it. So as you read the scenario and the required, you are very clear on what the problem you're about to solve is. You then, once you're clear about the problem, you then need to generate new ideas about what is it that can be done about source, what is it that can be done about whatever text principle that was under scrutiny, especially in your examination. So define the problem, generate new ideas, evaluate them, and then implement and evaluate as well. In defining the problem, one of the major assets that you need to have is the ability to deconstruct, see problems in their components, disaggregate the elements of the problem, and then rebuild via analysis. So you cannot be lazy. You cannot be getting into an exam, hard-coded, memorized positions, but an aggregator of things that they have been able to strip and break down themselves. Thank you.